Hey again, class. The sun has come out since I recorded my first video. I've just taught my two classes for the day and wanted to talk to you guys about what is essentially the third of the major terms that are going to be on the final exam. So we've had narrative uh, structure and time. We've had narrative um, space and place. And now I want to talk about narrative perspective and narrative voice. Um, and these three things can be a way of encapsulating a novel. Like, what is a novel? What's it about? Well, it has this structure, and it's told from this perspective, and it takes place in these kinds of places. Very useful when not only describing a text, but then starting to delve into it a little deeper, because you've given us these concrete um, narrative elements, and now you can break them down a little bit. You can use those to help you to analyze the text. So I want to, with narrative perspective and voice, I just want to sort of emphasize those two things. So we had a 4-part with time, 3 parts with space and place, and really 2 parts with narrative perspective. And the first part is who's telling the story, essentially. Who is our narrator? What kind of narrator do we have? We have first person narratives like we have in Parable of the Sower. Then we have third person narratives that we have like in The Road. But there's a lot more to say about those rather than just saying it's first person or third person and then you're done with it. It is what are the qualities of that narrator? What do we know through that narrator's perspective? They're like a filter through which we get access to what's going on in the text. For instance, Lauren's first person narrative is written as a journal, as a diary. So it is as it's going along, as she's experiencing the world, she's writing about that world. She has no idea what's going to happen in her future. So it is a linear text in which the narrator is anything but omniscient. She can't tell us very much about what's going on in the outside world because, well, they have a radio to hear about what happens on Mars. But she wouldn't know if there's a war in Iraq, for example. She's very limited in her knowledge of the world, so thus are we. And then we can ask ourselves, well, why is that? Why isn't it a more global novel rather than being very local? And I think that's a big question that we have. She does have some knowledge of other things that are happening, but largely through stories. She hears about the corporation that's taking over Olivar because it's happening in her community. The Garfields leave for it, for example. So it's a very hands-on knowledge of what's going on in the world, and it's very limited in that kind of way. Cormac McCarthy's novel is third person, but it's limited to the consciousness of the father, and that's called third person subjective, where we have only the knowledge that the father seems to have, at least at this point. We don't get to be inside the kid's head, and sometimes that narrator seems to go outside of the father. It has a certain kind of language, that very archaic language. I'll talk about that with poetics, and that's the way that the text is written. That's part 2. But we see through the father's eyes. We're limited to that. But we also get to see the father's memories. Sometimes he even, in the narrative, it's what the father is saying to himself in his head, and that's part of it too. The other side of that is the narrative, what we might call its poetics, its tone, its actual language. And you could say, well, what is the difference between the language used in Parable of the Sower and the language used by the narrator in The Road? And Lauren's speech is very plain speak, right? Is as if she's telling the story to us around a campfire, practically. It is very talky, and it is, there's also the poetry of Earthseed. So at times she is a poet as well in her writing. So it's plain speak, but then we have a second kind of narrative voice, which is Earthseed itself. So you want to think about that too, that it isn't strictly just the plain speak, but there's the poetry and the language and the tone of the Earthseed verses. Very different from The Road. We have these archaic words I have to Google sometimes. What does granitic mean, for example? Well, it means granite-like, and it's describing that creature that's inside the cave in the very first scene. There's a word I love in the novel that I looked up called discalced. And I'm like, what is discalced? And then they describe them as having no shoes on. And that's essentially what it means. It means barefoot. From, I think it's Latin for shoeless, being without shoes. And there's actually a group of monks called the Discalced monks. So it's a very kind of biblical term for being shoeless. The Discalced monks, they're what's called mendicant friars. They don't have anything. They wander the countryside and they depend entirely on charity from others. They don't want things. They've thrown off earthly goods. And if you see them in Italy, where I've spent a lot of time, I've done a study abroad in Italy, you see these old monks walking around and they've got calluses that are like that thick. Their feet are really gnarly, and they're the Discalced monks. So we get an almost biblical language, a language of the ancients in a way, and you could ask yourself kind of why that is. And I'll go much more into the whys of The Road in my next lectures, when I'm kind of talking about The Road and what it means, why we're even studying it, why it won the National Book Award, what is so special about this novel that it received the kind of acclaim, being a best-selling novel. Like, who wants to read a novel that's this depressing? Why the hell was it an Oprah book, you might ask yourself. But that's just some of the bare bones. And then we'll get to those thematic elements, which are like, how do we make meaning of this text? So for narrative perspective, it is who is this narrator that's telling us this tale? They're kind of like a tour guide for us, right? They welcome us into the world that the novel is going to explore, and that we're going to discover with it. And again, you can say it's first person for Parable of the Sower, and third person limited to the father, but there's also a kind of omniscience to that narrator. So that's going to be a quiz question, is describe Lauren as a narrator and what the perspective is there, and then the narrative perspective of The Road. And then I want you to talk about the tone and the language of both texts, as I've just kind of discussed it with you. Just show me that you watched the video and you absorbed it. Lastly, because I'm hitting 10 minutes, of my cats, of which I have 4 adolescents and my old lady cat. I have 5 cats, and I live by myself, as I've said. I haven't always lived by myself, but I live by myself right now. And I have two twin orange cats, and they are very rare. They are identical twins. They're all the same markings. The only difference is one of them has a slightly orangish eye. So unless you're looking right into the cat's eyes, you can't tell which one is which. And they're like two bookends. They do everything together. They sleep in the same positions. They're mirror image of each other. So I used to call them Robin and Bobbin, again, because I didn't plan on keeping them. And Robin and Bobbin are these old tramps that I met in Edinburgh. I don't think that's their real names, but they go by Robin and Bobbin. So initially the two orange cats were called Robin and Bobbin. Can't tell them apart, so I just started calling them both Bobbin. So Dr. Masters has two cats, both named Bobbin. Bobbin, as in a thread bobbin. So yes, I have two of my cats have the same name, and that is nice and weird. All right, so that's the bonus question. The 10th question is, I'm still at the University of West Georgia here out in front of the main building here. And I will record some more videos next week to talk about thematic elements in the road. And there'll be another video to pair with that as well. So this is the second video quiz now. All right, great, thanks.